Hello everyone, this is Clint with Bus Stop Studios. I am a bass player who's been using the Axe FX3 for a couple of weeks now, and I wanted to give a quick review and talk about my first impressions with some of the things that I love and some of the things that are a little bit limited. So let's jump right into it. So first impressions, the physical unit itself, the build quality is fantastic. Really solid unit. I like the 3U format with the bigger screen. I will say I am not a prior Fractal owner. I jumped straight into the Axe FX with the 3 itself. I haven't owned any of the rack or pedal board pieces of hardware that they have previously. But very impressed somebody who's bought and used a lot of gear with the build quality. The routing options on the box are really impressive. Lots of flexibility to have multiple inputs, multiple guitars. There's enough processing horsepower in the thing that you could run a guitar player and a bass player, through the box, no problem. Or microphones, different kind of vocal options if you wanted to put a little bit of reverb on a vocal if you're singing in a band, easy to do that. Reamping, side chaining. I will post a video on this later, but you could run, say, a kick microphone output from a mixer through the box and then use that as a side chain with a bass, in my case. So it's really cool routing options. As a USB audio interface, the unit is really fantastic to use. Install the driver, plug the thing in, and it's really great for any kind of DAW that you're using, or I find myself just loading up a backing track even without the DAW or playing along with something on YouTube. And the ability to do that sort of all in one box is great. I've used a lot of different other audio interfaces in the studio, and while this wouldn't be a multi-mic preamp model where you're taking a whole drum kit and running it through the thing, you can't do that. But for just sort of a standard 2 or 3 channel audio interface as an instrument player with a vocal mic or 2 instrument players, this would be all you would ever need. And it sounds great. So very impressed with it as a USB audio interface. Front panel is very useful. The screen is nice, and with every firmware update, I think we see different tweaks coming in. The only but I have there is that the Axe Edit 3 software is a dream to use. I love the way the block layout and the connections are made and the configuration here. I am not a Helix owner. I'm going to try to avoid making too many Helix comparisons, although I have used one for a few periods of time. I much prefer the editing in this software to anything I've seen, whether it's Line 6 with Helix or Eventide. I've owned an H9 pedal in the past, and Eventide's editing software is pretty good to use, but just the functionality of this software has been fantastic. So front panel's great, but when I'm plugged into the thing in the studio, Axe Edit software is just sort of always on. And the biggest portion of what I'm going to talk about today is really the bass specific aspect of me and this purchase and my use of it. The bass specific blocks, amps, and cabs are very high quality, but you're limited. So let's dive into that. So let's talk about bass amps that ship with the Axe FX3. You can skip down to the bottom here. There's about 262 amp models, and depending on how you were to slice and dice it, a very, very small fraction of the bass amps that are in, or sorry, the amps that are in Axe FX3 are bass amps. So here they are. You've got an Ampeg SVT. One. It's a very good sounding Ampeg SVT, but we're not quite sure which SVT model it is, what year, what kind of, there's a bunch of different configurations of amps that are called SVTs. We don't really know that, Fractal hasn't shared that, but you get an SVT model. You get an orange 8200B. I'm not terribly familiar with this. I've never played one in the physical world. I mean, maybe demoed one at a guitar shop once, but it's a good sounding amp, tube amp. You get the Mesa Boogie Bass 400 Plus, a couple of different versions of that with some switches engaged, I believe. Very usable tube bass amp. So those three are very solid. Then you have a amp which doesn't exist in the real world. It's a Fractal Audio Systems FAS bass amp, sort of a tube-inspired, their take on what a bass amp would be. It's an interesting model. I have used it a bit in Audition. I have not done any session work or recording work with it, but it's a usable amp model. And then you get these Fender Bassman amps. So my view is that they are in the Axe FX3 because guitar players like to play through them. I'm sure there'll be some people who disagree with me, but I think you see this in the attention to detail. You know, they're one of these or two of these are Dweezil Zappa's, you know, modded Bassman amps. So you can certainly play bass through them, but I think they're there to make guitar people happy primarily. So depending on how you count that, though, you're looking at just a very, very small number of bass amps that ship with the thing. So that's what you have to work with. If you're not a bass player, you might be saying, well, you know, quit your whining. You know, stop asking for esoteric stuff. This is not Fractal's biggest market. And I guess to refute that a little bit, here's sort of a tour of bass amps that are not in the Axe FX3. So Ampeg is a big name. In certain genres, they are the name for bass amplification. And they make a ton of models. The Portaflex B15 is legendary for studio work. SVTs of all different flavors are out there, and we get the one model. So I think that's a limitation. Nothing from Aguilar. The DB751 is a great amp. You'll see on a lot of stages, especially in recent years. Nothing from Aguilar in there. Nothing from Gallien-Kruger. The 800RB is, again, sort of a legendary bass amp, and the later solid-state 700 and 1001RB amp models. I own a 700RB myself. These are, you know, amps that are widely played and just don't exist in the Axe FX3 world. Nothing from, well, shouldn't say that, sorry. You get the one Mesa amp. Mesa make quite a few more amps in the bass world, so it would be great to see more options from Mesa. Nothing from PV. Nothing from Fender other than the 50s and 60s Bassman amps that are in there, but nothing from, say, their Super Bassman Modern series, which would be great to have in the box. Nothing from Eden. Their World Tour amps are amazing. Nothing from Mark Bass, nothing from Trace Elliot, no vintage gear like an Acoustic or Sun. Solid state representation, right? What's in the box is tube amps, which are great, but you know, we're starting to see all these hybrid tube Class D amps, pure Class D amps, the heavy iron big transformer amps like the GK 1001RB series, and you might argue, hey, if you're only interested in solid state, then just do something with say a graphical EQ or parametric EQ in the box and shunt it straight to a impulse response and a cabinet model. I haven't tried that. It probably can come close, but still there's no solid state representation really. And then some notable bass tone stacks. I'll stop harping about GK for a minute, but the 700, 1001 RB amps have some pretty interesting tone stacks that it would be cool to have in the DSP world. So yeah, there's a lot that's not in the box, right? So you look at these two lists and say, you get 3 or 4 amps that ship with the thing. There's a lot of the base world that's missing. And again, this is not esoteric stuff. I guess to represent that, I'll come back to this in a minute, but if you went shopping right now, I just pulled up the Sweetwater web page. If you went shopping right now for bass guitar amp heads and looked at what's most popular, you'd see of what you get in the Axe-Fx is 1 Ampeg SVT and really these kind of 3 brands that sort of show up as popular. And these are things that you're not getting, right? I mentioned nothing from Aguilar, nothing beyond the 1 amp from Mesa Boogie, and this is a Class D, but they have plenty of more recent tube amps in the bass world that you're not seeing. Nothing from Hartke, nothing from GK. Darkglass is becoming a force in the amp world, depending on what kind of music you're into. You do get have it in yellow here because you do get a drive section of this amp that is in the drive pedal block section with their B7K emulation. So there's just a lot that's missing in my view. If you were to compare, and again, I don't want to do this extensively, but I just quickly looked on the internet for what ships with the Helix. And if you look at the bass amps that are in a Helix, you can see there is a Portaflex. There is a Mesa M9 carbine amp in addition to the 400 pluses. There is that GK 800RB amp, which was legendary. They have added in recent firmware updates a vintage acoustic, a vintage Sun. They have added the more modern Aguilar DB751. So if you're looking from the outside, and again, I have not played through anything in firmware 2.2 or later. If you're looking from the outside, you might be tempted to say, well, Line 6 has a commitment to bass players, and they're adding new models. So, and down here you can sort of see from a cabinet perspective, which I'll talk about in a minute. There's a Portaflex cabinet that goes with the amp model. There's a 2x15 Powerhouse Mesa Boogie cabinet. There's a 6x10 cabinet. There's cabinets that support these vintage amps they've added. So we'll see how Fractal respond to bass players in the future. But just a quick comparison to what's been coming with firmware updates. Line 6 is throwing the basis of the World of Bone out there. So that sounds really negative. I do think it's a gap with the box, but I want to wrap that up with some really good news. The amps that are in the Axe-Fx are very, very solid, and they are able to produce tones that a lot of bassists would need. So you get some really wonderful, clean tones, whether it's the SVT or the Mesa 400 model, even the orange model. There's some really good tones that come out of the bass amps that are in the box. I made a quick YouTube video and showed you just quickly, if you're going to make a bass player happy, you're going to have to do some kind of SVT tone, and I was able to quickly put together scenes for some popular kind of real-world playing conditions of SVT at different levels of cleanness to dirty sounding tones, and the unit will do that quite well. I do wish we knew more about the SVT model, what it's based on, but the tones from the amps that are in there are good. They are very usable. Similarly with the effects, I'm not doing an exhaustive review of effects. There's a lot I have to dive down into the detail with, but if you were to look at, say, drive pedals, again, the list is ton of guitar drive pedals, and are there bass specific drive pedals? Very limited options. However, the Dark Glass B7K drive pedal that's modeled by Fractal is a very good model. It sounds like a real B7K, and it's got the flexibility and configurability to produce all kinds of modern overdriven bass tones in that block. So I think you'll find it's a similar story across the board, that there's not a lot of pedals in there, but what's in there is very, very functional. And the last thing that I would say is the flexibility of the way the Axe FX3 is architected and the way you can edit with it does allow you to use all these other guitar effects and chains. I would never go out and buy a ton of guitar dedicated effects units or pedals, but since they're in the box, I can create some really interesting tones that way. And you can also do what we've done for years as bass players and work around some of the limitations. So the example I would say is there's a full tone overdrive pedal in there. I haven't used that specific full tone overdrive that it's modeled after. I have used the full tone OCD quite a bit, and the full tone OCD tends to have a little bit of low frequency loss, and so the way you deal with that with the real world or in a DAW is you will run a parallel signal chain of your bass without the overdrive and the bass through a pedal like a full tone overdrive of some sort, and then you blend it back together to make up for that tone suck. You could do that in 2 minutes in Axe FX3, and so you can use a lot of those guitar models quite well with the bass. Is this a workaround to maybe some of the lack of support that's in there? Yeah, you could debate that philosophically, but I do think that it's really powerful and flexible. I'm able to do things here. A preset I've been using quite a bit has this upper guitar chain, and so I can play a clean, or I can add guitar in. I could use this Dark Glass model. Or if you want to get creative with that second chain, right? Here's a guitar rig overdriven on top. Yeah, very different tone. So the creative possibilities are there. So just to quickly review cabinets before I wrap up. There's a lot of cabinet models in an Axe FX. I've used this PowerPoint for my own benefit, really, to kind of separate out where the bass stuff is. So you get a Trace Elliot 1x15 in the Ultra Res bank. Haven't used it much. You get Ownhammer's 2x10 Ampeg with a few mic options. It's a really nice set of impulse responses. I have used it quite a bit. Austin Buddy has, well, they've included from him some Fender Blackface Bassman. I am a big fan of Austin Buddy's work with the Axe FX3, but I think we're going to be honest and say this is included because it's relevant to guitar players. That said, I have used these impulse responses with those Fender Bassman amp models, and they sound fine. So comes along for the ride as a bass player to get some of the work that's been done for guitarists. This is an acoustic 2x15 bass cabinet. I think it's very authentic. It's Dr. Bonkers, I believe. It's very authentic. It's not a tone I shoot for a whole lot, but I think it is very authentic to a big vintage acoustic bass cab. More Bassman stuff from Fractal, more Bassman amps from these guys. I haven't played through these cabinets a ton. There is one GK cabinet modeled, which again is another Dr. Bonkers cabinet model. I have owned a 410 RBH and still own a 210 RBH cabinet. It's tough to say because I'm not playing through a GK amp model, but this sounds what I remember the 410 RBH to sound like, and honestly the 210 and the 410 are pretty similar tone-wise. Love these cabinets. I'd love to see more mic options. The only downside to a 410 RBH is it weighs about as much as a small car. So good amp model or a good cabinet impulse response that's in there. Some SVT cabinets, ML Sound Lab. These are great. I love the different mic options. So good to see inclusion of that in the ultra res side. Fractal's 4x10 SVT models. These are also well recorded. And then probably a standout again from ML Sound Lab. This is a series of IRs mic'd up differently on a Powerhouse 1000 bass cabinet, which is a kind of unique bass cabinet. It's got 4 10-inch speakers in the corners, a 15 central to the thing, and then a horn, I believe, of some kind, or I think it's a horn tweeter. Love this set of IRs that's included, and I've been using it quite a bit in some of my work. So yeah, so you get a couple of cabinets, and Trace Elliot, Ampeg, the Fender Bassman, GK, SVT, and a Mesa Powerhouse. So there are options that ship out of the box or ship in the box with the Axe-FX3, and then of course you can go out and add more stuff. I think there's some missing things I would have liked to have seen. I'll come to that in a bit. You can't ignore the legacy cabinets that shipped. There's one 8x10 SVT bass cab, so one mic option, a non-ultra res impulse response that ships with the thing. I think this is a miss. I don't know how many times you've been to a show, but the standard rock backline is going to be an Ampeg with the fridge with an 8x10 underneath it sitting on stage there. You're going to find that a lot. And there really is only one legacy 8x10 model that ships with the unit. So that feels limiting. There's also a few 6x10 cabinets that are kind of missing in the world. 2x12s, bass 2x12s, so you'll find cabinets from a lot of manufacturers, whether it's Bergantino, Aguilar, GK, a lot of bass cabinets being made with 2 high excursion 12-inch bass tuned speakers, and you don't see any of that. So yeah, I think it's a similar story as the amp selection, which is what's in the box is very high quality and very usable, but it's limited. Hopefully over time, whether it's Fractal or other third-party folks, there'll be more impulse responses out there. And this is one area where I think I'm not so worried. You can produce your own if you really needed to, or you can buy third-party stuff. To me, the more frustrating situation is the amps that you get with the Axe-FX3. There's just not that many of them. So I guess to wrap up the first impressions, am I happy with the purchase? Yeah, I'm thrilled with the purchase. I think for me, I'm hitting off multiple use cases, however. While I'm primarily a bass player, I do work, as a small studio, so I get benefits from the box from its DSP processing capability to use with, say, vocals. I sing backup in a couple of bands or occasionally lead vocals. I can run my mic through the unit and avoid, a reverb box or other effects I might want to use on vocals. I have guitar player clients and friends, and I can plug them into a second input on the box and quickly run them through some, guitar nirvana that they're interested in achieving. Um, so, uh, so for me, I'm taking off multiple use cases, and the Axe-Fx does them all well. That the fact that it's a stellar USB audio interface, for instance, when you sort of factor in what I'm getting out of the unit, it's very worth it to me. I think the real question is, what will the amp and effect block support of bass products look like over time from Fractal? The Fractal forums and other bass players that are on the forums generally tend to be very negative. The sentiment is they feel like they've been promised things that haven't shown up. Again, I am brand new to Fractal. I guess what I would say is I hope that Fractal takes bass players seriously, because the starting platform with the Axe-Fx 3 is amazing. The sound quality of the amp models that are in the box are great. And if that same kind of attention to detail was put towards, including those Aguilars, those modern Fenders, those GK, those other amps that exist, and quite honestly are not esoteric stuff. I'm not asking for a specific, really niche boutique amp out there. These are things that get used all day long by many players in the industry. If those kind of models made it into the box, then I would say, this is a killer even for somebody whose only application is just a bass player and doesn't care about some of the things that I cared about when I bought the thing. So yeah, I think if you're aware that you're buying a unit that's primarily intended for guitar players, has some bass support, but what's in there is fantastic, and you're willing to invest the time and energy, and you care about the creative possibilities of using all the other functionality that's in the thing, then I think you'd be pretty pleased with the unit. And Fractal do have a long history and well-deserved reputation, I believe, from what I can read, about continuing to update their products. So this idea that bass amps will make it into the unit over time is not, an ill-founded idea. So I will not be a forum troll and maintain hope that that more amp models and maybe more cabs are supported by the community. But that's where I think it stands. Great unit. It's definitely meeting my needs. Would love to see it expanded with a firmware patch in the future with more amp models. But even if that never happened, I still think I'm happy with the unit so far. Yeah, so thanks for listening. I know it was a little bit long, but I'm going to continue to be making some videos about bass presets and walking you through how I've been building and using them. And hopefully you'll stay tuned for that. Hit the subscribe button if you want to see when updates are posted there. But for now, have a great day and enjoy making music.